Watch. I guarantee you are going to see some massive smearing going on among people right now calling for the end of chronic diseases by addressing our food supply. You just watch. There are going to be back channels and dark alleyways in which you're going to see a kneecapping of people through smearing and reputation smearing. And that's because we're taking on a gigantic industry, one of the largest. We're talking about big pharma, big food, and big ag all together. And we're saying enough is enough. When half of our nation's kids are sick, you cannot blame them for these sicknesses. So we're going to keep fighting until we can't fight anymore.
It's a pleasure to bring to us today Dr. Marty Makary. If I said that right. Anyway, you are recently a New York Times bestseller with your new book, Blind Spots, which talks about some of the blind spots we have here in medicine. And I know you've been on the scene. I know you were recently a part of the woo-woo caucus, as it's been dubbed, testifying in front of Senator Ron Johnson onto the problems we have with healthcare and nutrition and those issues that are affecting all of us and gotten to a head. I've been talking about this stuff for about 10 years myself. Tell us about your background. So I know you're out at Hopkins, you're a surgeon, so tell us a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, good to see you, Shawn. I am a public health researcher and trained clinically as a surgeon in gastrointestinal surgery and surgical oncology. I did my fellowship at Hopkins and have been there ever since. So my whole career has been at Hopkins, mostly focused on research in the last 5 or 6 years, but spent a lot of time specializing in pancreatic medicine, pancreatic surgery, and that field of medicine.
I remember when I was, as I mentioned, I'm an orthopedic guy. And I remember we had to rotate through general surgery as interns. I remember they always saying, don't F with the pancreas, because it's just, there's a lot of, they're doing Whipple procedures and whatnot. And obviously there's a lot of badness that can happen if you mess up the pancreas. So
you remember that, huh?
Yeah, I do. I don't mess with the pancreas. I can tell you that. I'm happy to mess with knees and shoulders and whatnot. But I don't actually practice anymore. I've just completely switched over to lifestyle. I'm a co-founder of a digital medical company. We just focus on nutrition and lifestyle to reverse and prevent disease. And so I think it's germane to some of the stuff you've been talking about. So let me just talk about first your book. So Blind Spots, where does that name come from?
I think smart people can develop blind spots in any field, but in medicine in particular, the power of groupthink, where we focus myopically on one aspect and ignore the entire universe of contributing factors, is epidemic. And medical dogma is epidemic in medicine. So when you look at what we're doing as doctors, a lot of us are on that treadmill. And you're probably off it now, Shawn. Congrats to you. That's what we need. We need doctors to get off the hamster wheel. But we're watching all of our chronic diseases skyrocket right in front of our eyes in our living generation. Diseases that were rare a generation or two ago are now common. We're watching infertility go way up. We're watching autoimmune diseases go way up. We're watching cancer rates with GI cancers go up. And so what we're doing as we watch this epidemic of chronic diseases is we're just so myopically focused on medicating and doing surgery, and we're not addressing the root causes. And the root causes are the things you're working on, and they have lived in the blind spots of modern medicine.
Yeah, I was in Oklahoma yesterday. I was actually giving testimony to one of the legislative committees over there trying to work on nutritional research as it pertains to chronic disease. And on the way back, I was listening to one of your podcasts you did with Z-Dog and Vinay Prasad, and just getting some of the stuff. And you talked about some of the topics, hormone replacement in women. You talked about just various testing out there that we've maybe missed the boat on. You want to, in your book, what kind of major topics are you jumping into with that?
So I wanted to educate people through the book Blind Spots on the biggest health topics we're not talking about that we should be talking about. Allergy prevention. We have a peanut allergy epidemic that turns out was ignited by medical dogma. Probably the biggest screw up of modern medicine has been, and it's a close tie between the food pyramid and hormone replacement therapy for perimenopausal women. But I would say hormone replacement therapy for perimenopausal women has really been a disgrace. The last 22 years, there has been a dogma that it causes breast cancer. and that for that reason you should not take it around the time of menopause. And it turns out there's probably no other medications, second to maybe antibiotics, that can improve the health outcomes of a population more than perimenopausal women starting hormone replacement therapy. The vast majority of women are candidates. Not only are their bones much stronger and they're at much lower risk of hip fractures and bone fractures as close to your field, but also their risk of heart attacks is cut in half in some studies. And the rate of cognitive decline goes down dramatically by up to 60%. And it reduces the risk of Alzheimer's by 35%. Women live longer, 3.5 years longer on average, and feel better. The long-term outcomes are separate from the short-term benefits of alleviating the symptoms of menopause. That is the hot flashes, night sweats, mood swings, sleep difficulty. So it has the short-term benefits of addressing the perimenopausal symptoms, and then it has long-term health benefits. And tragically, 50 million women over the last 22 years have been denied this incredible treatment because of the dogma that it causes breast cancer. So I do some investigative journalism. I interview the guy who first made the claim. He pointed to a study he had just completed. It turns out that study never showed a statistically significant increase in breast cancer or breast cancer mortality. Never did. And so when I asked him about that study published in 2002, he acknowledged to me that no study has ever found an increase in breast cancer mortality by taking estrogen. But this is the dogma to this day. 80% of doctors refuse to prescribe it or will tell you that it causes breast cancer when the backstory is just fascinating. It was essentially a fraudulent announcement. And I think everybody needs to know. So there's a bunch of these topics in the book Blind Spots I wanted to talk to people about so they could understand the backstory, the truth, and then make their own decisions. And so I go through the overuse of antibiotics, the issues of appropriateness of care in medicine, food and eggs, and so many of the everyday things where we condition the public to tiptoe around cholesterol in their diet. Turns out that's another giant fraud. We should not be telling people to tiptoe around cholesterol in the foods they choose. I wanted to write a book that told the story of groupthink, get into the psychology of why smart people can get this sort of myopic herd mentality, and also educate people along the way about truths that they may not be aware of that they should be aware of.
Yeah, I see parallels. Like, for instance, we think that protein is leading to renal failure. And that's another one I think has also been misconstrued. It goes back to Dr. Brenner's hypothesis from the 80s. I don't know if you've looked into that, but we have a number of these issues, and particularly around nutrition. And we've been told to fear whole foods that we have eaten for, thousands of years. And now all of a sudden we've got, and you've seen it's been all replaced with this ultra processed nonsense, which is, I think most of us would seem to think logically that that's the problem. And yet that has been largely ignored for various reasons. Some may be financial, some may be just ignorance. I'm not sure. Do you discuss that much?
Yeah, so I love it, Shawn. What you're talking about is the biggest blind spot in modern medicine. And that is, we have ignored our poisoned food supply, the ultra processed foods, refined carbohydrates, chemically engineered food additives and ingredients, pesticides coating our food supply. They discovered in one study pesticides in the urine of average children. There were, in one analysis just done, there were 38 different pesticides in one school lunch. And it's showing up in cord blood of mothers now. It's showing up everywhere. What's going on here? Do we really think it's such a mystery that all of these chronic diseases are going up? In the case of pesticides, is it such a mystery that the age of puberty goes down by a week and a half every year for the last 30 plus years? It's now years sooner in children in the United States than it was just a generation ago. Pesticides have estrogen-like binding properties. They are hormonal disruptors. Some of these chemical food ingredients are hormone disruptors. I got this box of Fruit Loops here from Europe. Now, what you'll see here in Europe is they don't have the chemical food dyes. The ingredients are, it says right here, stevia leaf extract, concentrated watermelon juice for color, and concentrated blueberry juice for color. Here in the United States, they make the same cereal, but they have chemical food dyes that are known to have associations with attention deficit disorder, hormonal dysregulation, and even genetic changes. So we've got to use common sense.
Yeah, the point that we're exposed to that is obviously problematic, but I think systemically why is that being allowed? And we look at our regulatory bodies, FDA, USDA, CDC, but the people that are in charge of our drugs and our food supply, there are some problems. There's some conflict of interest there. How do we fix that? Do we have to scrap it over? I know RFK is saying if he gets in, he's going to wholesale this. Is that what we need to do you think?
I think, number one, we need to educate the public as to what's going on. Do you think the public knows that Kellogg's makes one version of Fruit Loops for the United States, in the United States, and one version of Fruit Loops for Canada? They make it in the United States. One is healthier without the food chemicals in it. And so don't American children deserve the healthier versions of cereals made by an American company? So we got to educate the public. Vani Hari on the website foodbabe.com has some good information on how to pick different foods and what we can do to push these companies. She's doing a great job. So I think educating the public is number one. And then number two is reevaluating where we spend our taxpayer dollars on food in government programs like the school lunch program. Why are we buying these ultra processed foods using the old dogma that calories in equals calories out? Doesn't really matter where they come from. It's just a total calorie count. That was terrible medical dogma. It's done tremendous damage, as has the demonization of saturated fat while ignoring the role of refined carbohydrates and ultra processed foods.
One of the things I was frustrated as an orthopedic surgeon, busy. I had plenty of resources to do surgery. I had a multi-million-dollar operating room, physical therapy, radiology lab, all this stuff. We had millions of dollars of resources. But if I wanted to have somebody like clean up their diet and lifestyle, I had effectively nothing. There was really no resources for me. Can we change that? Because I think that is, like I said, we argue about this $4.5 trillion bloated chronic disease epidemic that we pay for. And instead, why don't we just not have so many sick people? Why don't we stop creating so many sick people? And if we were to put our emphasis on not even prevention, but even disease reversal, which I think is clearly possible. I see it every day. What are your thoughts on the resource allocation we have and the incentives we have as physicians to manage diseases, this sick care system rather than a quote unquote healthcare system?
Well, I think if you look at the 50-year track record of American healthcare and had to evaluate it, I would say the American healthcare system has done well at emergency care and very sophisticated operations. But when it comes to the health of the public, it has been a failure. We've watched all these chronic diseases skyrocket, and we don't even talk about it. Half of our nation's children are sick with obesity or diabetes or prediabetes, or they're overweight. 20% of our nation's children are taking a prescription medication now. What's going on? We don't ever talk about it. There's no incentive. I think we've done a terrible thing to doctors in this country, Shawn. We've told them, put your heads down, focus on billing and coding. We're going to measure you by your throughput. And we have not given doctors the time or resources to address the root causes of all of these conditions that are skyrocketing right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I'm sure you're aware. You look at the chart showing the rate of growth among hospital and healthcare administrators versus physicians. Physician is pretty flat, and then the healthcare administration is up like 1,000%. And so we have more people, bean counters and efficiency managers, just try to improve the billing. And it's not helping the healthcare. And I think you're absolutely right on that.
That graph is very popular in the orthopedics community, I've noticed.
Sure. I saw a little bit of your testimony with Chris Palmer's friend of mine, and a lot of the folks that testified for Ron Johnson. And I saw that Callie Means had tweeted out a press clipping that says, yes, we're recognizing how horrible chronic disease is. We've got 50% of our kids are overweight and obese, and on and on and on. But then they said this gives us greater incentive to improve Ozempic for everybody and have the taxpayers pay that. I don't know if you saw that, but is there some level of cynicism because you're saying that yes, it's a problem and the solution is just more drugs? Is that going to be the solution?
Look, I think all of us that are involved in this effort now are saying we can't keep throwing meds at the problem. We have the most over-medicated population in the history of the world. For what? For what health outcomes? The more antidepressants we prescribe, the more depressed we are. The more Ozempic we prescribe, the more obese the population is. The more diabetes medications we prescribe, the more diabetes there is. What's going on here? At some point, I'm not suggesting the meds are causal, but at some point we got to deal with the root causes, and more medications are not the answer. That is the exciting thing about that Senate roundtable you're referring to that we did with Senator Johnson. There is now a groundswell, a grassroots movement of people who are saying enough is enough. We live in a toxic stew. We don't even understand a lot of these chemicals, but we know it's not natural. All you have to do is go to Italy for a summer, and people with chronic abdominal pain can suddenly sometimes just feel great, and their pain is relieved just from eating healthy foods. You look at the United States population and what we're doing in our living generation, it's remarkable. And then we have a natural control group. A subgroup of the Amish population is still living off the land, and a subgroup is avoiding pesticides, and they're active. And what do you notice in those populations? Lower rates of cancer, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, autism, attention deficit disorder, all of these things that should be a signal to us that we may be going down a terrible path by just medicating people to death. Maybe we need to talk about school lunch programs, not just putting every young overweight child on Ozempic. Maybe we need to treat diabetes with cooking classes, not just throw insulin at everybody. And maybe we need to talk about the environmental exposures that cause cancer, not just the chemo to treat it.
Yeah, it's become my belief, having treated a lot of people now with various chronic diseases, autoimmune diseases, diabetes, obesity, and of course, all the orthopedic issues, that a lot of that, you're literally treating a nutrition-based problem. And a lot of it has addiction as part of that issue. And so if you're not addressing the addiction problems, in fact, I had someone who worked for one of these big food companies. She was a chemist, and she said her job was literally to make the food as addictive as possible. And she had tremendous guilt over this. She said, "Can I come work for your company because I just feel so built bad about this?" But it's one of those things where you have so many people that actually these foods have been designed to be addictive. We know that. Go back to Moskowitz and the bliss point and all the other chemicals that rewire our brain. We've seen studies on that. And so we're fighting against that. And at the same time, we're just going to dump more and more medicines to mask the symptoms in many ways. I'm just thinking about the wholesale change we'd have to do to the entire environment. And there's a lot of money involved in that. There's a lot of financial interest in not changing it. How do we get past that, do you think?
We got past it with cigarettes. We took on a massive industry. We rallied together. We educated the public. We used some good scientific research. We were aware of smear tactics for what they were. They were industry-driven smear tactics against doctors who were leading this charge. And watch, I guarantee you were going to see some massive smearing going on among people right now calling for the end of chronic diseases by addressing our food supply. Folks in this effort, you just watch. There are going to be back channels and dark alleyways in which, figuratively, you're going to see a kneecapping of people through smearing and reputation smearing. And that's because we're taking on a gigantic industry, one of the largest. We're talking about big pharma, big food, and big ag all together. And we're saying enough is enough. When half of our nation's kids are sick, you cannot blame them for these sicknesses. It was a small increase in sickness in young children. And you weren't seeing that in Japan. They were telling us these kids are bad kids. Now it's half of our nation's children. Are half of our nation's children lazy and disobedient? Or is this something adults have done to the children? Putting them on screens, getting them addicted with dopamine surges. They're increasingly inactive. We then chemically engineer foods to be addictive so that when they're eating these foods that are ultra processed, these chemical ingredients leave them feeling full. They feel queasy in their stomach, full, but their hunger has increased because the chemicals are designed to increase their appetite the more they eat. So the more they eat, the more they want to eat more. We're messing with Mother Nature. We are playing with the biochemistry of our nation's children, and enough is enough. So I hope we do see this movement that wants to talk about food and health and the environment and blends into the true environmentalism, not fake environmentalism. And so I think this has been historically a liberal Democrat thing. Now you've seen RFK and Trump come together on it. I don't care who is leading the charge. I just want to see this problem finally addressed where we can tackle the healthcare corruption where our big food, big ag, and big pharma has captured the regulatory bodies and the health agencies, authored the nutrition guidelines of the food pyramid, and then sit in the back wings telling us to do our job billing and coding as doctors. No, I think we have got to push back.
Yeah, I think we should as physicians, absolutely. And it's we see that 95% of the people sitting on the Dietary Guidelines Committee have ties to the food companies. It seems inappropriate, to say the least. We just came through this horrible pandemic, and I know you were a little bit outspoken about the concept of natural immunity. How dare we talk about natural immunity, something that has been like literally accepted as a normal thing for 100 plus years. And I think the whole COVID thing has woken a lot of people up to the regulatory capture, to the sort of misaligned interests around this thing. Censorship is another thing. I'm sure a lot of us were censored for speaking up and saying, hey, what about informed consent? I had my YouTube channel shut down 5 times for just saying you need a decent informed consent around this stuff. And you mentioned about the kneecapping. Are we going to have to deal with that? Are we going to now say the food pyramid is a problem, is considered malinformation or misinformation or whatever truth ministry term they want to use?
It's amazing. Almost every branch of government in healthcare, all the health agencies have these giant divisions dedicated to so-called fighting misinformation. The great irony is one of the greatest propagators of misinformation has been the United States government during COVID, ignoring natural immunity, insisting that young toddlers at the age of 2 had to wear a cloth mask for 3 years and saying that there were no downsides to it, suggesting that schools had to be closed for a year and 9 months in many parts of the country, and that there would be no downsides, forcing a vaccine booster in young, healthy people who already recovered from COVID. The most dangerous thing you can do as a society is to fire your 2 top vaccine experts at the FDA in order to ream through the COVID vaccine booster approval for children, and then mandate it for children, and then censor any doctor who speaks up. Now, luckily, the harm was, not catastrophic. It was present, and it's now being recognized, but didn't kill 50% of people who took it. But that process that they just did is the most dangerous thing a government can do.
Yeah, it's almost insane to think that actually occurred. And as I watched, same thing with some of the Alzheimer drug approval. I saw a recent drug where 12 of the 13 experts said this drug is not safe, it's not effective, and yet they approved it anyway. And it's just, what the hell's going on here? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. And where's the discussion of the Mediterranean diet, which has been studied and found to reduce cognitive decline in Alzheimer's? Where's the discussion of the role of chronic poor sleep as a cause of Alzheimer's and the importance of good quality sleep? Where's the discussion of hormone replacement therapy? That is, a woman replacing the estrogen they normally make after their body stops making it as an intervention that reduces the risk of Alzheimer's by 35%. That's one of the studies I describe in the book Blind Spots. None of those things are discussed. Instead, we created lots of millionaires with $1 billion drug from Biogen, and we said, hey, guess what? We think we found a monoclonal antibody for Alzheimer's plaques. It barely works, if at all. And it has high complication rates, 19% rate of cerebral edema or cerebral hemorrhage It's not a drug I want to take if I start getting Alzheimer's.
I think 50,000 a year price tag or something like that as well, some ridiculous number. And
Yeah.
we see these drugs, particularly these autoimmune drugs, and they're all $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $8,000 infusions given multiple times a year. And so that's the cost of that is just going up tremendously. You're at Hopkins, which is a storied, historic, famous medical center. Have you gotten much blowback from your administrative because you've been outspoken about some? Because a lot of people have been like hesitant to speak up due to worries about their career. How has that affected you?
It's amazing how many hundreds of doctors, maybe thousands, have reached out to me or told me directly, gosh, I love everything you're saying. I agree with everything. I can't speak up because of my boss or my hospital or my administration or my media and communications office at my university or hospital. But you keep going and you're doing a great job. It's amazing the amount of quiet, silent praise that we got, Shawn, during COVID. I have had a good relationship with Johns Hopkins. I've been there my whole career. They know me. They know I'm a reasonable guy and a good doctor, and I've been taking care of patients there for 22 years. So no, they did not give me a hard time. If anything, they invited me to speak to all the department leaders along with one or two other doctors because my dean said, hey, I know you have a different perspective on COVID policies, and so I think it'd be good for people to hear it. And so they gave me a forum. They did not give me a hard time. Now, the Bloomberg School of Public Health is an entirely different animal. I heard of faculty there getting pushed out because they opposed the vaccine mandate for young, healthy people. And the communications department at the hospital, they basically decided we're not going to ever do a press release for any of your research. And that's disappointing. It's probably just a couple people, but we put out the largest longitudinal study ever done in humans on natural immunity during COVID, published it in our #1 top medical journal, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. It was the number, I forget, 2 or 3 most discussed article of the year, according to the JAMA website. And Hopkins refused to put out a press release about it.
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to see how quickly people toe the line. And I don't know if as physicians we're trained to regurgitate and just, when you look at who they recruit, who does well in medical school, the guy that can take the test and answer the questions, is that necessarily the best quality? I was good at taking tests. Orthopedics not easy to get into. You got to regurgitate, and I was good at that. But I also fortunately have some ability to critically think. And when you start looking up, and again, we're siloed, and this is a thing you probably will also recognize, is medicine has become very much compartmentalized, whereas the cardiologists don't talk to the nephrologists, that don't talk to the ENT guys, and it's all just, we've become so hyper-focused that we can't see the big picture. And as you mentioned, it's just stop poisoning yourself. My gosh, a lot of this stuff would go away. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the root cause of so many of the diseases and medical conditions we see in every specialty is the same. All of these conditions in every specialty are connected. They're related to our food supply that is poisoned, the chemicals that people are now exposed to, general body inflammation, and alterations of the gut microbiome, with everything from pesticides to fluoride to seed oil. And we don't talk about any of these root causes, none of them in med school. I didn't get like more than 10 minutes on any of that. You think we were talking about the differences between olive oil and extra virgin olive oil and avocado oil versus the seed oils, the manufactured chemicals that sound natural, like vegetable oil, that's not natural. They're denatured chemicals. No, we never talked about any of that. Do we talk about the fact that those seed oils are pro-inflammatory and why we should maybe advise our patients not to be using vegetable oil and soybean oil and canola oil, and instead to use the healthy oils like coconut oil and avocado oil and extra virgin olive oil? The importance of eating organic when you're eating the surface of a fruit or vegetable. The average strawberry has been sprayed over a dozen times. Do we ever talk about any of that? No. And what are all these things doing? They're causing body inflammation. They're altering the gut microbiome, the lining of the GI tract, with millions of bacteria involved in immunity and digestion and mental health. Some of those bacteria produce serotonin. None of that. We don't talk about squat. None of it. Zero. And so what do? We come out with our prescription pad and our surgical knife, and it's go to work. And no one is talking about these root causes. They live in the blind spots of modern medicine. And that's why I wrote this book. I wanted people to know about medical dogma and what smart people are missing out on within the medical profession.
You're probably familiar with the GRAS designation, generally recognized as safe, where they have food. It's like they're generally recognized as safe here in the United States, but in every European country and half throughout the world, they're not. What is the problem with that process? I understand it's just like the companies themselves administer it in some ways. It's not very well. I think my understanding is if it's not acutely toxic and it doesn't cause some like mitogenic or genotoxicity acutely, then it's fine. It's considered completely fine, and we just unleash it on the population. And then when it's out in the wild, it's really hard to figure out how to do an RCT to prove or disprove whether it's healthy or not. What is it? I don't know if you know about how food is regulated in other countries versus here, or how do we get to something like that?
Yeah, so for your listeners, the GRAS standard means that a molecule is generally recognized as safe. So if a food company engineers a molecule and they just declare it to be, we think it's safe, then you don't have to go through any sort of regulatory process. You can just go ahead and add it to any one of these cereals or you name it. Squishmallows, I think, is coming out now. I think that's the name of it. So as long as you can basically just say, hey, we think it's safe, it's generally recognized to be safe, there's no need for a company to produce any real data to show that it's safe. Now, in Europe and Canada, let me focus on Europe, for example, they've got 1,000 different food chemicals that are banned that we have in our food supply. Because there they have a standard, which we have for drugs. It's basically guilty until proven innocent, right? We're not going to approve something unless you can show us that it's safe. That's our standard for drugs, but not for food. And that's their standard in Europe for drugs and food. So when we look at the surge of chronic diseases, you just look at autism, for example, which I think is associated with alterations in the microbiome and perhaps with some of these chemical ingredients. It's gone up 14% every year for 23 consecutive years. Do we care why? And does anyone have any interest as to why sperm counts have gone down by 50% in the last 5 decades? Who's working on that? Do we just go ahead and unload all these chemicals in modern society and say, oh, it's a real shame. The age of puberty just keeps moving up and sperm counts are going down. PCOS is going up, polycystic ovarian disease. Autoimmune diseases are skyrocketing. Half our nation's children are sick. There's probably no association because the food companies tell us these chemicals are safe.
As you mentioned, we did pretty good with smoking. I think 1954, we peaked at around 45% of the population smoking. Now it's somewhere around 13% last I checked. And so we were able to dramatically reduce it. And so if we say, hey, look, all this ultra-processed garbage with 75,000 unknown chemicals is a problem, do we ban that? Do we tax that? Do we educate? How can we go about fixing that? Because people are going to complain, you can't ban Snickers bars. Oh my God, that's communist or something like that. We're free to do whatever we want type of thing. How do we navigate that very narrow pathway of getting this stuff out of the food supply and yet allowing us still to have freedom of choice?
Yeah. I'm of the mindset, if you want to go out and eat 50 grams of sugar every day, do whatever you want. It's America. It's a free country. But when you're talking about using taxpayer dollars to buy poisonous food for school lunch programs, and then you're surprised why the kids have trouble paying attention after lunch when they're in a food coma, then we have got to recognize that simply throwing meds and putting these kids on meds is a crime. What's happening is a crime right now. We're not addressing these root causes. So I think it starts with educating doctors, because our medical education system has failed entirely on this topic. And so we produce these doctors by beating them down with this memorize, regurgitate drug names and enzyme names culture, when really what we should be doing is teaching them the basics of what they need to know, show them what they can look up, like the names of the molecules of the Krebs cycle. Why do they have to memorize the names for the exam, right? 5 different times in their medical education. You can look it up. We have computers now. And we've got to change medical education. Unfortunately, medical education is controlled nationwide. Every curricula is basically controlled by one private company. And that company, which does the accrediting and writes the boards, sets the standard for what every medical school teaches to. And so if there's no exam question on the Krebs cycle, they're not going to force you to memorize the Krebs cycle. If there is, that's what students are going to memorize. So we've got to start talking about food as medicine, general body inflammation, and toxic and occupational environmental exposures. So I think we can learn from the model of tobacco. We can stand together. You do see the medical community rally and almost turn into a mob on certain beliefs, certain things, vaccines, right? On the hepatitis B vaccine for newborn babies. Does a newborn in the labor and delivery room need a hepatitis B vaccine at that time? That's a virus that's spread through IV drug use and through sexual transmission. Do they really need it? These little babies, they need that inflammatory response on the first day of life. You cannot question it because the medical establishment has created this belief system that you either support 100% of the 72-dose vaccine regimen or you're an anti-vaxxer. And they've basically outlawed civil discourse in that entire world. I wish they would take 5% of their enthusiasm for that absolute nature that they've rallied around that vaccine schedule and actually talk about food as medicine and our poison food supply in school lunches.
Yeah, amen to that. I don't disagree at all. And there is, like I said, I think about, we're very fortunate. We live, in my view, the best country in the world. We have a tremendous amount of unlimited resources effectively. We have incredibly bright people, and yet we can't solve this simple, it's not even that hard of a problem to solve. It's just we don't have the appetite to solve this. And it seems, again, it's going to take enough of us, physicians, grassroots people, consumers saying, I'm just not going to buy this stuff anymore. I think that's ultimately how this is going to have to play out. But we're up against, as you mentioned, we've got these companies that not only own, they're capitalized to the trillions of dollars. They own a lot of the media corporations. They sit on the boards. They have, if you look at the advertising, you watch a TV show and every second commercial, some new drug. It's like, why is that? And it's, as you probably know, they're not even allowed to advertise drugs on TVs in most developed countries in the world. That's like US and New Zealand, I think, the only two that allow that. So we'll see if we can at least overturn. Would you be supportive of overturning? Do you think that the pharmaceutical industry has an undue influence on, everything? I don't know. Medical education. I know I was a happy third-year medical student getting my free pizza from the drug companies and get my pens and stuff, whatever, all the crap they used to give you. That's a problem.
Big Pharma has a hammerlock on American healthcare. They are the number one funders of corporate media that talk about what we're discovering and what we are doing research on. They are the number one funders of clinical trials at most universities. They're the number one funders of some medical curricula. They are the number one funders of the FDA. The body that is supposed to regulate them gets their money from industry. We need to address what I call healthcare corruption in government, which means start by follow the money and start by getting rid of so many of these intrinsic conflicts. And then I think what you can do, if you tell somebody, hey, here's a textbook about food chemicals, it's going to be boring. No one wants to read it. But if I write a book where I tell you the backstory of how industry took control of doctors in a field and reamed through a recommendation to their benefit, then now you've got an interesting story that you're going to remember, and you're going to see that issue differently because you see the motives. If I told a teenager, hey, cigarettes are bad for you, is that going to be effective? No, it's totally ineffective. There might be one responsible kid out of 1,000, but risk appeals to young people. They think they're going to live forever. They're not worried about that. But if you tell them you smell bad when you smoke and it turns people off, or big industry is trying to trick you into these addictive substances so they can take your money, now you've got a different dynamic. And all of a sudden, now you've got a dynamic where teenagers will say, you know what, I'm not going to be duped by this corporation into buying their product because it's addictive. And so we need to take a different approach. What we're doing now in addressing the health of the population is not working. The country's getting sicker and on more medications. We're on a path where everybody's going to be on 5 medications by the time they're 12 years old, right? We've got to do what you're doing, Shawn. And that's what I love about what you're doing. We need more doctors to take these bold steps and talk about health, not just playing whack-a-mole with sickness.
Yeah, I don't know. And this is maybe in a little bit in the future, but I just saw like we're talking about editing genes, and I think there was just a series of, I can't remember what the disease they were trying to treat, but 7 kids developed cancer. Young kids developed cancer due to this gene edit. They're talking about gene editing us so that we don't display cholesterol. So we have this constitutionally very low cholesterol because it's going to save us from heart disease. Now, God knows what else it'll do. I mean, we won't know for 20 or 30 years, perhaps, and the poor people that sign up for that. But you just see this, the technology is going to solve everything. You know, it's exciting. We got robots coming. Elon Musk has his self-driving car fleet that's coming out there. We're going to have a robot that does the dishes and does the laundry for us and all that, like the Jetsons when I was a kid. I'm sure you remember that show. But at the same time, we've got some technology that is, frankly, in my view, scary. I'm just like, I'm not signing up for that, and I'm not letting my kids sign up for that. But how do we rein that in? It's gosh, who's going to be the first kid that gets the gene editing that says they can't have cholesterol anymore? How's that going to work out?
Sometimes I think some of these higher ups that are doing big research, that they're doing this amazing, sophisticated stuff that's going to be the future of medicine. And other times I look at them and I think, what are you mad scientists up to? This is insane, right? And the Pima Indians in the New Mexico, Arizona area had their water supply diverted by ranchers and settlers. And the U.S. government felt bad about the Indians on the reservation experiencing a famine. So they recognized the injustice and started giving them free government food. It wasn't organic kale and healthy stuff. It was junk food. It was food that was terrible for their health. It was ultra processed food. And so guess what happened to the Indian tribe? The rates of diabetes and obesity went from 1% to 90%. Now, instead of recognizing the obvious, you know what the NIH did? They dispatched their genetic scientists to go down to their Indian reservation and draw the blood of these Pima Indians to look for a gene that predisposed them to obesity and diabetes. It's like a bunch of morons. What are you guys thinking? Sometimes in medicine, we cannot see the forest from the trees. And the modern day equivalent of that story is that we are watching all these chronic diseases go up right in front of our eyes. And what are we doing? We're tinkering with medications that can maybe manage them a hair better. And we're not looking at the root causes.
I spent some time out in New Mexico moonlighting on some of the Indian reservations when I was in the Air Force. And it was a miracle if I didn't have a patient it wasn't on dialysis with severe diabetes. It was like completely unheard of to not have a patient like that. So it is just utterly decimated that population. We see all these particularly like the Plains Indians who used to live on a very different diet than we, and then we stuck them on the reservations and fed them flour and sugar. And then they just completely got sick. And there may be some genetic predisposition for that, but that's not the root cause. It's just crazy that we would go there with their genetics and not just say, hey, look, you've been feeding them garbage. And that's why they're sick. So let me get back to the woo-woo caucus, because the Atlantic magazine called you guys the caucus, just to, as you said, to start to attempt to smear what you're trying to do, which anybody would say, hey, this is clearly the right thing to do. Everybody's in the right place. Their intentions are good. And we're going to smear that as some sort of, how dare you interrupt the status quo of keep feeding people poison and just provide them the drugs. Put everybody on Soma like it was Huxley's Brave New World. Everybody had Soma. I think that was a book where that was given out. But where do you guys go from there? We don't know who's going to win the election. This should be a bipartisan issue. I don't know why both sides are not talking about this. This is, in my view, we can't have a successful, healthy, progressive country if everybody's fat, sick, depressed, dependent, and fighting with each other. So we've got to address this issue. What do you think happens next? Or what do you want to happen next?
I think that Senate roundtable on chronic diseases and making America healthy again was historic. You had Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, didn't matter. No one cared. No one was even checking labels. It was, as Bobby Kennedy said, a gathering centered on this concept of, can we love our nation's children more than we hate each other? Can we recognize we have differences politically, but all agree on this one topic? You just had, right after that Senate roundtable, you had Gavin Newsom address food dyes in school lunch programs in California with a swift action. Now, for the politicos, where everything is left and right and they live in the echo chambers, they don't know what to do. They're totally discombobulated. Wait a minute, is this us or them? Or wait, well, I'm supposed to oppose anything where the orange man is? I'm supposed to hate this, but this is something where Democrats are also on board. A lot of these deranged people, these sick people out there who frame everything as political in the United States. These are not people who think independently. These are people who just sign up for the program. They didn't know what to do, and so they're paralyzed right now. And I will tell you that, as you may have heard, the real battle in the United States is not what people think. It's not Republican versus Democrat. It's people who are lying to you versus people who are trying to tell you the truth. It's the corporate and ruling class versus the everyday American reasonable person. And so we're energized by that Senate roundtable. And if people haven't gotten a chance to see it, I posted parts of it on Twitter. I'm sure you've posted it, Shawn. It was the most amazing 3-hour roundtable I have ever heard in my life. Mothers and experts and doctors and scientists and politicians and people coming together to talk about this issue of finally addressing chronic diseases at the root cause level. And I think the hit piece in The Atlantic by some young woman, I don't know who wrote it, I didn't recognize the name, that came out immediately afterwards, which didn't make any specific criticisms, just kind of name calling. In Baltimore, where I practice medicine, we call that a drive-by shooting. And I think it helped fuel the energy level. People just looked at the absurdity of how can you criticize a group of mothers and doctors and educators who are rallying together to try to help make America's children healthier by addressing our poison food supply. And so I think the movement is alive and well. This is the first time in American history where we have seen the political will to take on these giant industries. But you're right, because of who we're tackling, get ready for what you will see as some major smears. I'm sure against me, but against everybody who was at that roundtable. We're taking on big pharma, big ag, and big food. And so we're going to keep fighting until we can't fight anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, just, I don't know if you saw Callie and Casey Means. I know you probably know both of them. They're part of that roundtable. I think we're on Rogan the other day talking about this. And we're getting more. And I was on Rogan back in November. Again, I was talking about this issue back then as well. But my one concern is, we'll get some sort of token sort of response. Oh yeah, we'll take the food dye out of there, and then that's it. And it's just, or when the political season's done and everything settles down, because everything, obviously the rhetoric's high and everybody's got these great promises and aspirations during a political campaign. January, February next year, what happens? Do they pass some minor law that says, and then we're happy with that? I think it's important to keep the pressure on and say, no, we're not going to accept one little token concession. It needs to be a full, basically, revolution on what we're doing here. I think we need to get the conflict of interest out of the FDA, out of the revolving door. You see all these guys that are CEO of Pfizer now sits on the board of the FDA. This is crazy, or board members on the FDA. So I think we have to keep the pressure on. And I think it's going to be something that I hope that we all have the energy to do, because as you probably know, it's exhausting. I mean, you get worn down. I do. I'm trying to fight this stuff all the time. I'm flying around all over the country trying to talk to all these people. And it's a lot of hard work, but I think it's worth it in the end.
Amen, Shawn. We've got to keep fighting, and we can't let the politicians do what they typically do, which is give you a little lip service, pass some small, little, tiny incremental reform, and then give up and move on to the next thing. And really what they're trying to do is hoodwink the public. And so we're not going to stop. So it's not one thing, right? It's not banning one food dye. It's not banning glyphosate in our nation's crop supply. It's the cumulative burden of all of these chemicals, all of it, the ultra-processed food, the seed oils, the food dyes, the chemicals, the engineered ingredients that make food more addictive. It's the way they can pack sugar into some of these products. It's cutting pesticides. It's addressing school lunch programs. It's educating the public. It's exercise and fitness. And everyone tends to think, we get fixated on one thing. You talk to people about the issues of why kids are obese, and they'll immediately go to the one thing that they were told. Oh, it's all this and it's all that. No, it's the cumulative burden of all of it. And so the good news is all of us that are fighting on this issue are trying to talk about all of it. And we're not going to stop with just one tiny incremental little solution.
Yeah, that's good to hear, because I like I said, I'm just wondering, how do we know when we're there? And I mean, you think it like our life expectancy for the first time in 50 years is going down. In the last couple of years, the trend has gone down. Obviously, our BC rates are through the roof. I saw some graph where the obesity has peaked and it's gone down a little bit, and everybody's trying to hail Ozempic. And if you look at the timing, it doesn't even make sense from a timing standpoint. Are we going to accept? We're happy with 40% obesity. I think we need to get it back down. If you look at Japan, it's 4% or something like that. Right? It's a very different culture, obviously, and there's different genetics that have to play there. But there's no reason we shouldn't get our numbers back to what we had in the 1980s or something like that. I think that's very well within reason. If you think about when have we achieved enough? And I think, if you want to put some metrics on there, that's what I would suggest. Is not we decrease the rate of increase of obesity by 5% or something like that. We see somebody celebrating those, but those aren't real victories. You want to say I shouldn't look like when I was a kid, there was one fat kid in my class. That was it in the whole school. Now it's like every second kid, and so we've got to get back to that.
Yeah. That's why I love what you're doing. It's why I wrote the book Blind Spots. I wanted to educate people about these root causes and also just educate them on the big health topics where dogma has ruled the day. I think it's important for people to know about the nuance in medicine. For example, C-sections save lives and they're necessary sometimes, but about 40% are unnecessary. And if you have an unnecessary C-section, you may be needlessly altering the microbiome of a child a little more than is otherwise being altered from the ultra-processed upbringing. Antibiotics save lives. You and I have seen it. They're amazing, but 60% are unnecessary. We need parents to stop shaking down their doctors for antibiotics, because what's happening when you take an antibiotic you don't need, it's carpet bombing the microbiome and altering that composition. And a study out of the Mayo Clinic just found that when young kids take antibiotics compared to kids who don't, those kids have a 20% higher rate of obesity and even a 32% higher rate of learning disabilities like attention deficit disorder, a 90% higher rate of asthma, and nearly a 500% higher rate of celiac. All studies I go through in the book. And by the way, farmers have noticed this for a long time. If you give an antibiotic to an animal, the animal is fatter. And that's why they use them, unfortunately.
Yeah, the ionophores, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. We don't talk about this stuff in medicine, but this is what the public needs to know. And when I find a new study and I show it to a colleague of mine, a doctor friend at Johns Hopkins, and say, hey, I know you're in the field of asthma. Did you see this study on altering the microbiome increases a child's risk of asthma? And they respond by saying, no, I've never heard of that. Can I see the study? Here it is. Oh my gosh, that's incredible. Yeah, this might be the mechanism. And now if they are shocked by some of this new research, do you think the public is learning about this stuff? And the reason they're shocked is not because they're bad doctors. It's because we're so siloed and we glorify and celebrate and worship the hyper subspecialist in medicine. I'm one of them. I'll tell you, you're one of them, right? So we need those people, but we need to look at the whole person. We need to look at the body holistically. And that's something that modern medicine has had in their blind spot.
Yeah, it's a great way to end. Thank you very much. So where can we get the book? It's called Blind Spot, bookstores, Amazon, so on and so forth. Where's the best place for people to get that?
The book Blind Spots is available wherever books are sold. It's sold out nationwide on opening day 3 weeks ago.
That's a good sign.
I guess it's a good sign. I got a lot of emails and messages. Hey, you're sold out on Amazon. They've slowly restocked it now. So there's a little delay of a week or two, I think, when you order it now on Amazon and other places. But it's been running hard on the New York Times bestseller list now for 3 weeks. And hopefully, as people get their copies, they'll enjoy it and spread the word. So thanks for having me on, Shawn, to talk about it. Really
awesome.
enjoyed it.
And just for your social media, you're on X now instead of Twitter. Where do they find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on all of the platforms. I got somebody helping me now with TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. I manage my Twitter account, so send me whatever you like to post. And I love using the platforms to encourage people doing good work like yourself, Shawn. So keep up the good work, and happy to connect on social with any of your listeners.
All right. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Shawn.
All right.